taught me the Old Testament. I'd known it beforehand, but I went to Bible college and she was very patient and gracious with a guy who would hand up his assignments late, but unpacked and ignited a love of the Old Testament in me. So I'm really grateful for that. And I'm really excited that you're here to share with us today. Let's pray for her now. Lord God, we thank you for our sister Melinda and the way that you have equipped her to equip us for the work of the gospel, for the love and the delight you've given her in your word, and the ability to help us to explore that. Holy Spirit, fill her now as she speaks to us. Fill us as we listen, that we might hear what you have to say. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. It is great to be here with you. As Jeremy said, I used to spend a lot of my time teaching the Old Testament, not so much anymore, but I still love the opportunity when I get it. Currently, I have the privilege to serve our wider family of churches. So talked this morning about Broady being a family, a wider family of churches that we're part of, Baptist Churches of South Australia and the Northern Territory. I was actually in Alice Springs last week preaching there, and so I had a good chat to Gavin, and he said, I'm preaching down in Adelaide in a few weeks' time at a church called Broad something. I said Broadview. So I look forward to that. He'll be great. Just really thinking through up there what it means to be the church in a town that has its own unique challenges and circumstances. So I think that would be really wonderful. But a couple of weeks before that, I also had the privilege of being part of the Baptist World Congress. Rach was there as well, really celebrating our global Baptist family. We are a part of a family of around 53 million people across Baptist churches globally who are members of what we call the Baptist World Alliance, and about 3,000 to 4,000 of those people gather together in Brisbane every 5 years. There's a congress somewhere in the world, and this year it was in Australia. And it was a wonderful time to worship and get a taste of what that picture the Bible presents of a family made up of people from every tribe and tongue and language and nation. But it was also really challenging to recognise and hear stories that the majority of our brothers and sisters around the world live in places of war and conflict and poverty and injustice. And to hear stories from our family in those places. So I chaired a panel of speakers from the General Superintendent of the Baptist Union of Ukraine, who shared how they've been coping over the last 3 years with their circumstances. The General Secretary of the Baptist Union of Bangladesh, where they're facing ever-increasing persecution. And one of our Baptist leaders from Myanmar, who's actually in exile because he's been accused of treason for being a medical doctor and a Christian who was serving the people of his country. When the junta came in, he had to flee. And to hear stories like that, and we met a wonderful woman from Syria, from the Baptist church in Damascus, and the stories they shared of how they are sowing into the lives of young women who have experienced horrific sexual violence and have found rejection from their own communities, but safety in that Baptist church. And we also heard from some of our brothers and sisters from the Middle East, from Israel and Palestine. And I'm not here to make any political statements. I know different people have different views, but I think we can all agree that God is on the side of justice and on the side of the vulnerable. And a couple of years ago, when the war started in Israel and Palestine, there was actually a joint statement put out by the 11 Baptist churches of the region in both Israel and Palestine. We have Baptist churches in both, calling us to pray for them as they sought to live out the justice and faithfulness of God in that context. I guess what was really challenging to hear at Congress was that now today there are 10 Baptist churches, because there used to be a Baptist church in Gaza and there is no more. Our brothers and sisters that there are no longer. And so to hear what is happening in places around the world, I think that deep cry for justice just bubbles up, right? How can this be? How long, O Lord? When will your justice come? And so it was wonderful to receive the invitation, and also challenging to receive the invitation and come and be a part of this series that you are doing on justice and what it means to have a just God. When we look at what's happening in the world, but also in our own lives, in our own context, in our own everyday situations, what does it mean to have a God who is just and to call us to be a people of justice? And I really love the way that you're doing this over looking at the different parts of the scriptures and getting insights from the different ways that God speaks through different time periods and different types of literature throughout the Bible. And I have the privilege today of opening up the Old Testament law. Doesn't that sound like fun? We're going to spend, thanks. At least Steph's with me. She's excited. So I wanted to start by asking you a question. This is not a rhetorical question. This is a genuine question. I'd love to hear your answers. What comes to your mind when you hear the word law? Steph, you can stay quiet. Everybody else, what comes to your mind when you hear the word law? Corruption. Law and? Sorry? Fast cars. Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Sorry? Protection, police, order, law and order. Yeah, you've been watching much TV. What else comes to your mind? Kevin, come. Justice, getting into trouble. No? Safety? Anything else? Law? Judges? Courts? Sorry? Lawyers. Yes, there's a million lawyers jokes. I've probably heard them all. I studied to be a lawyer once upon a time. Anything else? It's a bit of a mixed bag. I would say mostly negative with a couple of positives in there. Thank you for the people who had things like protection and safety. But generally when we hear the word law, a lot of our minds go to things like getting in trouble, the police pulling you over in your fast car, taking you to court, being sentenced, punishment, prisons, judges, those kind of things. Or, as I said, I studied law, people's minds in lawyers, jokes about lawyers and how they're corrupt and they're all just on about the money and they just, yes, it's not a very positive word, I would suggest, in Australian culture today, the word law. And so we come to talk about the Old Testament law, and we actually have this baggage that we bring into the conversation. And so what I'm going to do today is one very deliberate thing that seeks to overcome just a little bit of that baggage is I'm going to put the word law aside, and I'm going to use the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is the word Torah, or Torah. That's the name of this part of the Old Testament. And yes, it is usually translated into English as law. It's a valid translation. But when we translate it into English and use the word law, we bring all that baggage back into it. Torah, for the people of the Old Testament, was seen as a gift, was seen as a joy, was seen as a delight, so much so that the writer of Psalm 119 can write the longest chapter in the Bible as a love song to the Torah. Now, as I said, I studied the law. I don't know anybody who's writing love songs to the Criminal Offences Act of 1934 or to the Australian Constitution or to any of the legislation that we have in our cultural context. Torah must be so much more than what we think of as the laws on our books. Torah was the gift of God, much broader concept than law. The Hebrew word actually comes from the verb to teach, Torah. And so the teaching of God or the instruction of God would be another valid translation. It focuses on how to live. And in fact, in terms of the books of the Bible that we call the Torah, it includes an awful lot of story, narrative. It's not, again, you pick up one of the South Australian Parliament Acts, there's not a lot of story in there, not good bedtime reading. Well, they are good bedtime reading if you can't sleep, but, they don't tell you the story, they just give you the point 1 A, B, C, D, F 2.37. That's how legislation works in our context. Torah includes the story of God and the instruction and teaching of God to his people. And in Deuteronomy in particular, the expected responses to Torah are so much broader than we might think of as the expected responses to law. Basically, the laws, you should obey them, right? Or you'll get in trouble. Torah is designed to be heard, listened to and obeyed. That's the Hebrew word shema, which you may be familiar with. It's the number one response to the Torah is to hear it, to listen to it, to take it in, to drink it, but also to keep it, to guard it, to walk with it, to walk in it. The word yalak, to walk, is actually really commonly associated with Torah. It's something that you actually live out through your feet day by day. You are to love it and to have it in your heart, to hold it, to meditate upon it, and of course, to do it, to practice it, to live it out. So let's talk about the Torah today and how the big picture of the Torah reminds us of the justice of God. I want to read to you from Exodus chapter 19. Just a few verses that is actually God introducing the Torah, if you like, for the first time. Exodus chapter 20 is the 10 Commandments, very well-known passage in the Bible. But in Exodus 19, Moses has gathered all the people at the foot of Mount Sinai, and when he's about to go up in chapter 20, and God will give him the 10 Commandments and then the rest of the Torah, the teaching and the instruction that they will live by as his people. But before God speaks the words of Torah, he kind of introduces them and gives us this really helpful frame to think about the Torah. So let me read from Exodus 19, verse 3. It says, Moses then climbed the mountain to appear before God. The Lord called out to him from the mountain and said, give these instructions, this Torah, to the descendants of Jacob, the people of Israel, saying, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I brought you to myself, and I carried you on eagle's wings. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among all the nations of the earth, for all the earth belongs to me. And you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Give this message to the people of Israel. I think the translation on the screen that I put in and the one I read is slightly different, but hopefully you got the gist. But this beautiful introduction that God gives to Torah, where he does put it in the context of the story. God has rescued his people. He's carried them on eagle's wings. What a beautiful picture of grace. Torah comes not before grace, but as a response to God's gracious act of his people. God rescues them, then invites them to live that out in practice. Torah, sometimes if you've read some of the things that Paul says in the New Testament about the Torah and particular interpretations of what Paul says, I would suggest. People think that the Old Testament people thought they had to keep the Torah in order to be kind of acceptable to God. That's actually not what God's saying here at all. It's completely the other way around. God has rescued his people in an act of grace and love and mercy and made them his own. Then he has given them the Torah that they might live that out in practice. They don't earn God's favor by keeping Torah. They respond to God's grace by living out Torah and enacting it in practice. That's the purpose of Torah. And so I want to share with you this morning, I think, 4 key things that I think this passage and the whole of the Torah teaches us about God, what they reveal to us about God and what its purposes are, and then ask some questions about how that works out in practice. So the first thing I think is really clear here is that Torah expresses the character and the purposes of God. Torah expresses the purposes and the character of God. This is not an arbitrary set of rules. It is actually an overflow of the heart of God himself. First and foremost, the Torah reflects who God is. In fact, a common motivation given in the Torah, in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, for the Torah is, I am the Lord. And that can sound like God saying, well, I said it, so you just have to do it. It's actually not what's going on. It's God saying this law, this Torah, this instruction, this teaching reflects who I am. I am the Lord, therefore. Torah is a reflection of the character of God. So when God says, thou shalt not kill, to quote the King James, it's because God is a God of life. God created and breathed life into being, and God is seeking life flourishing in all its fullness. When God says, thou shalt not lie, it's because God is a God of truth. The Torah reflects his heart and his purposes. When God says, thou shalt not commit adultery, that's because God is a God of faithfulness who keeps his promises. Everything in the Torah is a reflection of the kind of God that God is. This is most easily seen in the 10 Commandments, right? Every single one of them is a reflection of the kind of God that God is. Some of the more specific laws, you have to do a little bit more work to think, well, what does this tell me about what God is like? How does this reflect the character of God? But that's the key purpose for the whole Old Testament. Or as Leviticus 19 says, you must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. The law is a reflection of who God is. And you know, we see that same character reflected in the life of Jesus. The image of the invisible God, this surprising God who walks amongst us and comes not to be served but to serve, who lives out truth and humility and justice and who seeks good of others and who is compassionate and gracious. Jesus is the embodiment, living, walking, breathing embodiment of Torah, the character and purposes of God. So if we can see Torah that way, we'll begin to understand what God is calling us to. So that's the first thing. Torah expresses the character and purposes of God. Secondly, I would say that Torah invites us to live, therefore, as God's community. Torah is an invitation. an invitation to live as God's community. For Israel, the Torah outlined how they were to live as the people of God, as the redeemed people of God. If God has rescued you and He's made you His own and He's called you by name and He's created you as a community, what does that look like in practice? How do we do that tomorrow when we wake up? How do we live in the promised land for the people of God? They didn't see it so much as rules and regulations, but as a whole statement or a whole standard of what it means to be the people of God. And that also means that it suggests that some of the individual specific instructions in the Torah could be adapted to the specific circumstances they find themselves in, because this is about what it means to live as a community. The Torah is what enables them to live together. See, most of us at least, I know me, if I speak for myself, have grown up in a Western cultural perspective that thinks of everything individualistically. That's like my primary filter for life, is to think me, you as individuals. That's not the case in the Old Testament. That's not how people saw the world or how people thought. They saw themselves first and foremost as a community, as a unit of people. And this is what enables that community to function. It is actually kind of something that has carried over into our culture today as the basis for our legal system. One of the reasons we have laws in society, right, is so that we can function as a community. You know, why do we have a speed limit? Well, if it's just about me, I could just go as fast as I need to, as long as I didn't make any mistakes, right? But actually, I'm not the only one on the road. You're all on the road too. And so we need to set some kind of standard that says, this is how we're going to do this together. And in a sense, we have covenanted with each other, or we've agreed with each other, this seems reasonable, right? Yes, now you might not feel like you had a say in what speed limit is on what particular road, but our whole system is built on that premise that together as a community, we have decided this is a reasonable limit to put on it so that it will function, so that we can all get where we need to go, and so that we don't all kill each other on the roads, right? That's the general idea. How do we live as a community? That's how the Torah works in the Old Testament for the people of God. Again, let me read from Leviticus 19. It says, "Do not do anything that endangers your neighbour's life. I am the Lord. Also, rebuke your neighbour frankly so that you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself, for I am the Lord." How do you function as a community? Well, if you understand who God is and you see yourselves as living a community that lives out the reflection of that nature of God, then you will treat one another with love, and with justice and with compassion, and live that out in practice. So Torah, again, is not this burden that is placed on the people that says, here are the laws, here are the rules you have to live by. It is this invitation that says, let's live this out in practice and be together, a community that functions well, that flourishes, that enables all of us to experience joy and life and freedom together as one. And again, I think we experience this same community in Jesus' kingdom at its best. The church is designed to be a place where in the kingdom of God, through Jesus, we live out what it means to be God's community. Being a Christian is not an individual pursuit. The question is, how do we make this work together as a community? How do we live it out in your family, in your neighbourhood, in your community, in your church, as a global church? That's God's goal. God's goal is to have a people, a community, who are together living out his purposes and his character. So Torah is this invitation to us. You might think, well, why? What's the goal? Why are we seeking to do this out? Well, that's my third thing I want to say, that living Torah becomes a witness to the world of God's good purposes. If Torah is a reflection of the character of God, an invitation for us to live that out as a community, then it becomes a living witness to everybody else of what God is like. And that was the purpose of Torah in the Old Testament. The people of God in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel back then, were called to live out this kind of life that made everybody else look at them and go, what? What's going on there? What kind of God do they have that makes them live out that way? That's what Torah does for the people of God. It has a missionary purpose. Now, this is linked to this first idea of it being a reflection of the character of God. If you're living out a reflection of what God is like, then people are meant to look at you and go, oh, that's what God's like. I didn't realize. He's that kind of God. He's got a truth. He's got a justice. He's got a compassion. He's got a love. So when people look at the church, when people look at the people of God in the Old Testament, they are meant to see what God is like. And God uses these two images here to Moses in the passage I read from Exodus of being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And those are both images with this missionary purpose. The key idea that they are holy means set apart, different. People are meant to look at them and kind of a little bit scratch their heads and go, why are they so different? What does that tell me about their God? And this idea of being a kingdom of priests, a priest is the one who kind of mediates between God and his people. The whole nation was meant to do that, mediate between God and the world. So the people of God living according to the Torah will show the world what God is like.